What is going on, Chess YouTube? In today's video, I'm showing you a brutal game that Magnus Carlsen just played against the Indian superstar Arjun Erigaisi in the 2025 Chessable Masters Tournament. Let's dive right in. In the game, white opens 1 e4 and black goes e5. Then we have knight f3, knight to c6, and finally bishop b5. The Ruy Lopez opening is the opening of choice from the GOAT Magnus Carlsen. Now, what will Arjun Erigaisi go for? Well, this guy is very aggressive. He does not go for the Berlin in this game. Instead, he goes for the Morphe defense with the move a6, driving back that bishop. White goes bishop a4, black goes knight f6. So far, very standard stuff. And if white castles, then black has a wide variety of plans he can go for. But instead, in this game, Magnus goes 5d3. He's a big fan of this move, and it avoids a lot of lines from black, including the open Spanish. All right, now black goes b5, driving back that bishop once again. White goes bishop b3. And then here, Arjun goes for the move bishop c5. This is all very, very standard stuff so far here. And of course, if black doesn't go bishop c5, if he goes, say, bishop b7, then white is going to have some additional possibilities based on the fact that he did not castle his king yet, and therefore bishop c5 is the main move here for black. Now here, white has a million different options, including, for example, a4, c3, knight d2, bishop b3, bishop g5, short castles, h3, and so on. In the game, he does go a4, putting pressure on that pawn on b5 immediately. And here the main move for black is rook b8, and this was played in the game by Arjun. Now, you can go b4 instead of rook b8. However, overall, rook b8 is a little bit safer, as with that bishop on c5, rook b8 does synergize with it a little bit better. All right, now here, white takes on b5. A takes b5, then we have a takes b5, and then we have short castles and d6 from Arjun. So far, very standard stuff. Now here, white still has a number of ways to play aggressively here and still play for some sort of d4 break. For example, you can go c3, then h3, and so on. But instead, in this game, Magnus going bishop e3. Now, this move is a quiet move. It doesn't really fight for an opening advantage that hard. However, it is a little bit tricky, and there are a lot of ideas to know here. All right, in the game, Arjun, he ignores the bishop. He does not trade on e3. You can do that. You can go bishop takes e3 right away, forcing f takes e3. But instead, Arjun, he castles his king, a solid move. White goes h3, guarding against any sort of bishop g4 and maybe knight d4 ideas, which would put pressure on that knight on f3. And now Arjun does trade on the e3 square. So bishop takes and then f takes, and we now have a very interesting pawn structure. White has this semi-open f file, exerting some pressure either directly or indirectly on that pawn on f7 between the rook and the bishop. Now here, Arjun, you can ignore this pressure and continue developing. For example, knight e7, intending knight g6 and c6 is a very common idea for black in these sort of Italian game style structures. But instead, in the game, Arjun, he actually goes bishop e6, challenging the white bishop on b3 in the spirit of the Italian opening. And now here, white has a choice. Do you trade on e6 or ignore the bishop and let black go d5, effectively equalizing on the spot? Now, in the game, Magnus, he does trade on e6. We have bishop takes e6, then f takes e6, and Magnus so far is sort of getting what he wants in this game. He's got sort of a quiet position. He does dominate the open a file. The pawn on b5 is a little bit weak, and of course, his knight has not committed to c3 yet. Therefore, he can go, say, knight d2, c3, and so on. And Magnus has sort of a very small but very stable edge out of the opening. All right, now here, Magnus, he continues. Knight d2, potentially intending knight b3 or knight f1 ideas later. Now here, Arjun Erigaisi, is very important to find the right follow-up plan right here in this position. And the fact that white has control of the open a file does make things very, very tricky. If you go, say, knight e7, intending knight g6, that is a very common idea in these Ruy Lopez and Italian-style structures. Then white can jump in with his rook to a6, getting a lot of activity, threatening queen to a1, doubling up major pieces on the a file. Now, instead of that, the right move here is knight to b4, intending a very fast c5 advance, and of course, the knight does guard that a6 square for now, stopping rook to a6 ideas. Instead, in the game, Arjun, he actually breaks in the center with the move d5. Now, this move is very, very thematic. Black seems to be gaining space in the center. He seems to be almost fighting for an edge here, but all is not as it seems. Here, Magnus will be fighting for a significant edge, as this move is just premature. All right, Magnus, c3 is the move, bolstering control of the b4 and the d4 squares and opening up b3 for the queen if it needs it. Now black goes b4, gaining more space, trying to open up the b file for his rook on b8. Now Magnus, rook to a6 is the move, jumping up with the rook, threatening the very weak knight on c6. Now, where is that knight going to go? Well, for now, it's not going anywhere. Here, Arjun, he says, you know what? I can counterattack instead of defending. B takes c3 is the move. The point being, if you take the rook, white takes on d2, black takes on d2, and black is doing just fine. Now, instead, B takes c3 played in the game, relieving that threat, and now, of course, you must do something about that knight on c6. Now, black has a few different options. You can move the knight to, say, e7. You can go queen d7 or d6 defending, and you can also go rook b6, as Arjun did in the game. So, rook b6, the idea being, now the knight on c6 is defended by the rook, but of course, white can trade on b6, damaging black's pawn structure a little bit on the queen side, and that is what he goes for. So rook takes b6, then c takes b6, and then white goes queen b3, flying out with the queen, pressuring the pawn on b6. Now here, it turns out, according to the engine, there isn't a whole lot black can do. Ever since he went for that premature d5 break, he sort of has to sit around and wait and patiently defend. Now, the computer says the best move here is simply h6, not a very fun move to make. You're basically playing a waiting move, passing the ball back to white's court. Now, instead of that, queen d6 was played, and this move looks in some ways more logical to me. You are giving up that pawn on b6 to get counterplay in the center, but here Magnus finds a very simple way to counter this. You don't take on b6. Instead, you go e takes d5. The point being, after e takes, now this pawn on e5 is officially pinned to the king on g8, and white has a number of ways to exploit that, including the very creative move knight to e4 as played by Magnus in the game. Now, what is the idea? Of course, you cannot take the knight. That pawn on d5 is being pinned to the king, and beyond that, you are threatening ideas like potentially knight takes f6, potentially other annoying ideas. Now here, black, he goes queen d8, getting his queen out of the attack of the knight on e4. Of course, if you take on e4 with a knight, knight takes e4, then white takes back, and again, the pawn on d5 is pinned to the king. If you leave it, white takes. If you advance it, white can take on d4 as well. Either way, white has a lot of pressure here. So, in the game, Arjun, queen d8 was played, dropping back with the queen, stepping out of the attack for now. Now, white goes rook b1, sliding over with the rook. Now here, Arjun, how should he proceed? It turns out here you have to get some sort of counterplay going on the king side. You simply cannot sit around and wait for much longer, and therefore the right way forward is knight to h5, potentially intending knight g3 ideas, again trying to get some counterplay on the king side. Now instead, knight a5 was played in the game. What is the knight doing on the a5 square? Honestly, I'm not sure. It does put pressure on that queen on b3, but beyond that, it's not doing a whole lot. And here, Magnus, he takes on f6, black takes back, and then he drops back with the queen. Queen to a2 is the move. What is the idea? You get the queen out of the attack and maintain pressure on that pawn on d5. It is still pinned to the king on g8. Now, black goes knight c6, getting his knight back into the game. And now here, Magnus, e4 is the move, piling up more and more pressure on that pawn on d5. e4 is good, but I do want to point out, you can also go rook to b5 here, applying pressure with the rook lift on the 5th rank. That is the computer's top choice here. Instead, e4 was chosen, also very good, also applying a lot of pressure on that pawn. All right, Arjun Erigaisi, knight e7 is the move, defending with the knight. Now here, Magnus, he knows with that knight not on c6, the pawn on e5 is undefended, and he just jumps in with his knight. Knight takes e5, bang, winning that free pawn, and now Arjun is officially on the ropes in this game. I mean, how how did this all happen? Magnus just running circles around the Indian superstar so far in this game. It's like he never even had a chance. All right, Arjun, queen c7, applies pressure on the knight on e5. Now white goes knight g4, returning the favor on that rook on the f6 square. Now black goes rook d6, centralizing his rook. White goes rook c1, supporting the pawn on the c3 square, and black goes rook to d8. Now here, Magnus, d4 is the move, a very strong move. The point being, if black takes on e4, well, first of all, you can't, as that pawn on d5 is still pinned to the king on g8. But in the future, if you do, the pawn on the d file will not be hanging to the rook on d8. And beyond that, of course, white also has ideas based on e5, pushing that pawn even further forward, gaining space on the king side, and potentially starting some sort of king side attack. I mean, Magnus has many different ideas going here all at once. All right, Arjun, before white can go e5, he slides in with his queen. Queen to f4 is the move, staying very active. White goes rook e1, defending the pawn on e4 from the queen. And now Arjun plays a very active move, my favorite move on the board for black. That is the alpha 0 move, h5, driving back that knight. The h pawn has entered the game and is now a fighting piece. Black may even go h4 later in the game, clamping down on that g3 square. Now the knight jumps in, knight to e5, an active square for the knight, eyeing that g6 square. And now Arjun, queen to g3 is the move, lining up the queen to that pawn on g2. Now here, Magnus, he makes maybe the first mistake of this game so far. Up until now, he's played literally like not flawless, but pretty darn close to flawless chess so far. And in this position, he does make a mistake. Now, what is black doing? The queen is very active. It's pressuring g2. It's pressuring c3. The c3 pawn is actually hanging right now. So what should Magnus do? If you like puzzles, pause the video right now and try to find the right follow-up idea for the goat in this position. And while you're at it, go and smash that YouTube like button. It really does help me out a ton, so please do that if you can. And if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel. All right, here, the best move for white is going to be rook to f1, applying pressure on the open f file with the rook and threatening various ideas, including knight f7, rook f7, and so on. Now, instead, in the game, Magnus, he goes for the move queen to f2, offering the queen trade. Now, we all know how much Magnus loves a good endgame. However, this move is very, very weak. I mean, just look at the eval bar on your left, collapsing with this move queen to f2, going from over +3 to, roughly plus 0.6, meaning most of Magnus Carlsen's advantage has disappeared with one simple mistake. Now Arjun, he doesn't miss his chance. He trades down to the endgame. Queen takes, then king takes, and then he goes d takes e4, rook takes e4, and then finally the move b5, clamping down on b4, threatening b4 ideas, removing the defender of the pawn on d4, and suddenly Arjun has counterplay in the endgame, and he's relatively okay. Yes, Magnus is still up a pawn in the endgame, but it's not that much, and Arjun will have decent drawing chances. All right, now here in the endgame, rook e1 is the move, dropping back with that rook. Black goes knight d5, pressuring c3. White goes rook c1, defending c3, and then we have rook to c8. Now c4, Magnus trying to trade off pawns. Black takes, white takes back. Then we trade the rooks. Rook takes and knight takes. And now suddenly we have an endgame where white is up a pawn. Both sides have knights. It is a knight and pawn and king endgame. White has the extra pawn. Is it going to be enough to win the game? Honestly, I'm not sure. Knight endgames are relatively easy to win for the side with more material, so I think white should have good winning chances theoretically. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong. I think theoretically, white should have pretty good winning chances here, but again, it's sort of like a 50-50 toss-up. We'll have to wait and see what happens. All right, black, king f7, centralizing his king, then king to f3, and then g5. Arjun gaining space on the king side with those king side pawns. Now we have knight e3, offering the knight trade, and of course, if you trade knights, that'll be a one endgame for white on the spot. Just look at the eval bar skyrocketing for white after this move. So, of course, you got to keep those knights on the board. Now, Arjun, knight f6 is the move. We have king to e2, king to e6, king d3, and then black goes h4, clamping down on those kingside pawns. Of course, g3 and g4 ideas are not possible now as black recaptures en passant, and black would effectively be winning at that point. All right, white, king c4 is the move. Black goes king d6, and this right here, believe it or not, is actually a massive mistake. Instead, black had to go knight to e4, jumping in with the knight for reasons that are simply beyond me. I'm only rated about 2,000 on Lead Chess, 1,800 on chess.com, so, you know, don't hate me for not knowing why this move right here, knight e4, is better than king d6, but trust me, it is, according to my good friend Stockfish. So, instead, king d6 chosen in the game. This move turns out is losing after white goes d5, gaining space. Now black goes knight h5, jumping out with his knight to the edge of the board. White goes king d4, and again, according to the engine, white should be winning here with precise play. Black goes knight g3, jumping in with the knight. Knight c4 is the move for white, pushing the king back, and therefore white will be able to go king e5 or king c5 on the next move. Black goes king d7, white goes king e5, centralizing his king. The march of the pawn continues. Black goes knight h5, dropping back. King to f5, knight f4, and then knight to e3, defending the pawn on d5 with the knight, and now white is simply threatening. King takes g5, winning that pawn, then perhaps h4, and with that, the game. What is black going to do? He goes king d6, but now Magnus, he gobbles up the first pawn. King takes g5, black goes king to e5, and then we have knight g4. The knight delivers the check, forcing the king back, and then white can take on h4. So we have king e4, and then d6. The pawn continues his march. Knight e6 hits the king and guards that d8 square, stopping the advance of the pawn. Now we have king takes h4, king d5, d7, king d6, knight to f6, defending the pawn for now. King e7 drives back that knight. We have knight to e4, and then finally king takes d7. But it is too little, too late. White has two protected, connected, passed pawns on the king side, and is Arjun Erigaisi going to be able to stop those pawns? I don't think so, but let's keep going and find out. White goes king g4, king e7, h4, then knight d4, jumping down with the knight. Now king g5, king f7, h5, king g7, g4. The pawn march continues. Knight e6, king h4, knight d4, g5, knight f3, king g4, knight d4, knight d6, knight to c6, and now we have knight f5 delivering the check. The king moves for white. Knight b4, knight e3, knight d3, king f5, knight c5, g6 hits the king, king g7, knight g4 covering both h6 and f6. Now we have knight d7, h6 check, drives back the king, king to h8, and now the last move of the game is simply knight to f6. And in this position, Arjun Erigaisi resigns on the spot, and this is why. If you trade knights, white takes back. For example, knight takes, the king must move. Then you can simply go h7, king h8, g6, move the king up, and win the game. Now, instead of that, if you don't trade knights, let's say you go knight to c5, then white simply goes g7, and here the king is under check. You can't go to g8, you can't go to h7. It is checkmate on the spot. So for that reason, in this position, you either get checkmated or you trade knights, and you still get checkmated. No matter what, white wins, and therefore Arjun Erigaisi resigns on the spot to Magnus Carlsen. Wow, what a game between Magnus Carlsen and Arjun Erigaisi in the 2025 Chessable Masters Tournament. Very impressive stuff by the GOAT. Magnus, he has not lost his edge yet. This guy is still running circles around every other grandmaster in the world right now. It's really amazing to see. So, hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, smash that like button for me and comment down below in terms of what you thought of this game. And if you want to see more Magnus versus Arjun action, check out this video right here where I believe it's Magnus plays an absolutely unthinkable queen sacrifice on g2 as black right out of the opening. It's on move like 10, 11, 12, something like that. That game was absolutely mind-blowing. If you haven't seen that game, check it out. It features one of the craziest queen sacrifices you will ever see Magnus play, especially against Arjun. And I'll see you in the next video.